My name is Melissa Oberg, and I'm a principal consultant for Leading Agile. I've been working with Leading Agile for 4 years now with lots of different organizations on how to influence their organizational change. Change is hard, and transformation is about change, and change is hard. Making any meaningful change requires people to think, feel, or do something different. Another way of saying this would be we need to get people to move. We've got to get them to move from where they are to somewhere new. The challenge is that where they are is really comfortable, and it's what they know. So changing from the known to the unknown is uncomfortable, and it can be really scary too. Have you ever tried to enact change in your organization and found that it wasn't really successful? You create this vision, you communicate that vision, you create a plan for the change, and then you just expect that that's what's going to go happen. Then, 6 months later, you realize that your change hasn't been realized. The plan's complete, but there hasn't actually been any meaningful change. Or maybe the plan that you started with just keeps getting longer and longer and longer to complete because you find that no matter how much you communicate the vision, things just aren't actually changing. Maybe you found that there's resistance to change, and no amount of meetings or trainings is helping to actually reduce that resistance. The key to creating lasting organizational change is that those being changed need to be fully participative, immersed, engaged, and on board. Change can't be something that's done to the organization or for the organization. Change is something that has to be done with the organization. Those who are implementing the change need to have a vision or a hypothesis for what the change will look like when it's complete. We need to share that vision with the organization, and it needs to be customized where appropriate to make sure it fits. There's no one-size-fits-all for transformation or change. Next, we need to enact the change and show the organization what the new normal looks like. Last, but certainly not least, we need to sustain the change over time. We don't want to spend a bunch of time and effort and money doing transformation just to have everybody go back to the way that they were doing it a few months later. PSTIR is the way that we create this change. It is a strategy for aligning beliefs across the organization so that we can engage those being changed. Remember, change is something that we must do with the organization and not to them or for them. PSTIR can be applied to the change that is made with individuals, teams, organizations, or the system itself. The basics are the same regardless of where it's applied. Let's dive in deeper. So PSTIR stands for Prepare, Socialize, Tailor, Implement, and Reinforce. Every organization has some backlog of improvements that's going to enable them to create the future state vision of what they want for the organization. So to start working on those changes, we want to focus on outcomes, not on outputs. An outcome is results driven. When we're done, there's change. An output is activity driven. We might be counting something, but we're not counting a thing that's actually going to let us know whether or not we have true change. So an organization that wants to be more predictable might focus on the outcome of forming teams, building backlogs, and producing working tested product. More often than not, the changes that we make in the organizations build off one another. So for example, if we're talking about wanting to get to that predictable state, we can't start with the working tested product. We have to start with building teams, forming those teams so that they have everything and everyone that's necessary to deliver. PSTIR enables us to work through a prioritized list of outcomes to create meaningful and lasting change. I'm going to go into a lot more depth about each one of these pieces because there's a lot to learn about these different pieces. But let's talk about the high-level definitions. So when we prepare, we need to be clear on how the system's going to be different after we make the change. And we need to know who the leaders are and who the influencers are that we need to work with to go make that change. Then we socialize the changes with those leaders and influencers and listen to their feedback. Next, we tailor the changes to make sure that it meets the needs of the organization. Remember, it's not one size fits all. Then we start to go and implement the changes, and we need to immerse the organization in those changes in that future state. And finally, we're going to reinforce the changes by looking for the measurable results to show us whether or not we've effectively made the change and achieved our outcome. We start with prepare. We need to make the change, and we need to be clear how the system is going to be different in that future state vision. The future state vision has to be measurable. That will enable us to validate whether or not we're actually successfully executed the change. As part of prepare, we also have to develop a hypothesis of what the change is that needs to happen in order for the system to get a different outcome than we have today. We need to know what future looks like, and then how are we going to go get there? Finally, as a part of prepare, we need to be clear on who needs to be involved in the change. We need to have the insight and deeply understand what those people believe about the current system so that we can engage them and get their feedback in what the future state looks like and have them see themselves in that system in order for us to be successful. In prepare, we determined who those leaders were and who the influencers were. And in socialize, we're going to start engaging them. Those are the people who need to be involved in the change. So we start socializing with them and start aligning them as to why we want to make the change and what the change is going to look like. It's crucial that we listen to their feedback. There's no point in engaging with those leaders and then not listening deeply to what they have to say. Remember, we need them to be fully participative, immersed, engaged, and on board. It's very likely that they're going to have feedback as to why or why not they think that this change will work for their organization. The goal is to create the clearing and the conditions that are necessary for change to be executed. Now we move on to Tailor. So in Socialize, we heard that feedback. In Tailor, we're going to do something about it. We need to take their understanding of why something will or will not work and put that into our plan. We need to gain their agreement on how we're actually going to go and implement the change. As a part of that, we've got to make sure that we're customizing it to meet the needs of their organization. Remember, transformation isn't one size fits all. We've got to bring it all together. Now that we have a tailored plan for the organization, we can start to implement executing the change to make it real for them. This might be trainings, workshops, one-on-one coaching, and so on. The important thing is that we have to make sure that the organization that's being changed gets immersed in what we're doing. This involves setting the vision, but also helping them to see what their work will look like in a future state. It's important to focus on the intent of the change and not get over-focused on the plan. We're done with implement when we've installed the change that needs to happen in the organization, not when we've completed a checklist. Finally, we have reinforce. Change takes time. And once we've done all that we think we need to do to implement the change and install it in the system, we need time to be able to see the results. As we're looking for measurable results, we might find that we've got to go back and repeat previous stages, or that what we did wasn't successful and we've got to find another way. We've got to learn about the system and help that inform future changes. Once we do see measurable results and we've achieved the outcomes, we've got to celebrate. Like, it's really important that we celebrate those successes along the way in a very public way, because that's going to help us continue to elevate the influence in the organization. So what is PSTIR? PSTIR is a way of progressively elaborating our change backlog and engaging those implementing the change and those being changed together. We're going to prepare for how the system will be different once we make the change. We're going to socialize the change with key leaders and influencers to align them around the change. We tailor based on their feedback. We implement the change in the organization. And finally, we reinforce the change, that the change happens. And we've got to celebrate those successes. We started off talking about how PSTIR was a strategy for aligning beliefs, and that makes PSTIR also an influence tool. Influence is about having the right conversations and enabling the right agreements to solve the organizational problems to achieve the vision. Trust is the currency that we have to have in place to have continued influence in the organization. The influence and trust loop is something that we leverage as we're working through the PSTIR change model. Let's start by reviewing the influence side of the influence and trust loop. Influence begins with access. Before we can make the change, we have to get access to the right individuals or the right group who are actually empowered to make the change. And it's really important that the people that you start working with are empowered to make the change. Then we lead with empathy for their problem and demonstrate understanding and compassion for their challenges. As change agents, we've got to understand the problems and the opportunities that they face personally so that we can show them how we can help them. However, it isn't just enough to just understand their problems. We also have to be able to have a clear point of view on how we can go and solve them in a way that's really, really meaningful to them. We then need to make it safe for these individuals or these groups to actually go and implement the changes. So now let's relate this back to PSTIR. PSTIR begins with preparing to make the change. So to prepare, we need to be clear on how the system will be different after we make the change. To understand what needs to be different after we make the change, we need to have empathy for the current problem. The next step in PSTIR is to socialize. Socialize means working with the leaders and the influencers who are involved in the change and gaining alignment with them on why we want to make the change. And part of gaining that alignment is creating a shared point of view for how the system's going to work in the future state. Like after we make the change, they have to be able to see themselves in the system. Next in PSTIR comes Tailor. By tailoring the changes that we're making, we're creating safety in the system for them to go and make the change in a way that works for their organization. Moving over to the trust side of the loop, once we've established influence with the leaders and the influencers, we can start to gain agency to go and actually solve the problem. Agency is permission to advance along our mutually agreed upon path. So we created a whole plan as we were going through the influence side of the loop, and now on the trust side, we've got to go do some execution. Integrity is established when we consistently execute on that agreed upon path. And we have to create a shared understanding of how execution is progressing. We want to do that with as much clarity and as much transparency as possible. We further establish trust when we create a demonstrated ability to create opportunity, overcome obstacles, and navigate the path to success. We need to demonstrate competence in the execution of the work and in the ability to communicate with the stakeholders to follow through on promises. Last, but certainly not least, we have to have results. Results are proven delivery with clear measures of success. Results have to be captured in a way that's meaningful to the leaders and influencers, and we have to show results if we want to get continued access. So now let's bring PSTIR back into the picture. On the influence side of the loop, we finished by creating safety to make the change by tailoring. On the trust side of the loop, we're now implementing the change. And as we do, we need the leaders and influencers to facilitate the change in order to drive to the outcome. And where we need it, we've got to be able to escalate those changes and have them resolve problems as they arise. This is key to delivering with integrity and competence. If we don't have the right things that we're doing, and we're not executing on them with integrity and competence, we're not going to actually be able to go and implement the change. Finally, we have reinforce. where we need to understand whether or not we were successful in achieving our results, or if there's more work to do in order for us to change the system. We started off by talking about how transformation is about change and change is hard. Change can't be something that's done to your organization or even for your organization. Change is something that has to be done with the organization. The approach that you cultivate along your journey can, however, help you create change. PSTIR is a strategy for aligning those beliefs to create lasting organizational change by creating that system for those being changed to be fully participative, immersed, engaged, and on board with the future state vision. Change is hard, but leveraging PSTIR will help you enable lasting change.